Hi, I'm Anya Kotz, and you're listening to A Millennial's Guide to Saving the World. I started this podcast because I was tired of being stereotyped as lazy, triggered, and entitled. I wanted to give voice to a different kind of millennial and invite us to write a new story. One of a generation willing to challenge the status quo, embrace nuance and paradox, and reject PC culture. This podcast isn't about finding answers. It's about asking the right questions. How can we reinvent ourselves and the narratives we've been expected to inherit? How can we take ownership over the ways we participate in our own suffering? How can we move beyond victimization and into empowerment? How can we fix ourselves to fix the world? It's time for new dreams, new stories, and new futures. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the podcast. 3 episodes in 1 week. Not really sure what got into me. Can't necessarily say that's going to happen again. But here we are. Thank you all for everyone who listened to last week's podcast and gave me some feedback about how much content I released. I figured y'all would be pretty cool with whatever felt right to me, which is mostly the feedback I got. So thank you. I would really like to try to release an episode a week, but sometimes it just doesn't happen. And then sometimes you get 3. I don't know. I don't really subscribe to schedules. I feel like after working in the corporate world through my 20s, I just don't care really, or I don't want to care. That's a more accurate description of how I deal with things I need to do. I definitely care, and I definitely hold myself to standards I can't follow through on, and I definitely want to upload more than I normally do. But as I've mentioned a million times, and I'm sure you guys are sick of hearing it, but definitely wanted to keep this project as authentic and intuitive as possible, which means there isn't really a schedule. It just sort of happens when it feels right. So yeah, we are leaving Colorado in a few weeks. Of course, our internet goes down right before we leave, so we're having to drive to our friends' houses to upload our podcast and do work at the critical time when we really needed internet before we left. No idea when it's going to be fixed. And we have 1 bar of service here in the middle of nowhere. So yeah, just trying to cram it all in with things coming at us unexpectedly. Life. Today's episode is with my dear friend, Jenny Kellogg. She has been on the podcast before. I don't remember when, maybe a year or so ago. Was it that long ago? I don't know. Maybe it was in the fall. I honestly don't remember. I remember the room I was in when I recorded the podcast with her, which is in this house, but a different room. So it had to have been in the fall or the spring. Not sure. But we recorded a really great episode. Jenny is an astrologer. I met her in this valley, actually, at a retreat for our astrology apprenticeship back in 2018. And she's a close friend of mine. I'm sure some of you have had readings from her, which is amazing. I love being able to sort of bring in my friends, especially my astrology friends, and have them offer this community readings, which is something that I'm not offering anymore. So we can sort of all, add to the community in the ways that feel right and authentic to us. And I love being able to delegate tasks to others. I feel like I'm super into that idea in all contexts, whether that's living in a community where people live reciprocally and everyone sort of takes care of what they're good at and what they enjoy, or with this podcast as well. Jenny's actually going to be teaching a workshop to my patrons this coming weekend. It's at 10 a.m. Mountain Time on Saturday. She's going to be doing a workshop on the lunar nodes, which have a lot to do with our soul's journey. So if you are interested in learning a bit more about astrology, taking a workshop from Jenny, the way to do that is to sign up on Patreon, patreon.com/Anya Kotz, ANYAKAATS. If you sign up for the Renegade level or higher, you will get access to that workshop. You will also get access to the workshop I will be hosting the following weekend. Although I'm hosting it, my friend Whitney, another astrologer who's been on the podcast, is going to be doing a workshop on Saturn and Aquarius. Whitney came on the show not too long ago, and we talked about Saturn returns and sort of polled the audience if you guys would be interested in doing a Saturn and Aquarius workshop. Saturn is in Aquarius right now and will be for a little while. And you guys very much wanted to do that. So Whitney is going to also be teaching a workshop to my patrons. I wanted to speak a bit about Patreon. I know I do sometimes, but I'm going to talk about it more. It was funny. I got some feedback from the episode that I released last week, the solo episode, where the feedback or insight was interesting. It was that I referred to you all as you all and you guys, like as if you're a collective instead of just you individually. And it was interesting to think about this because that wasn't ever a decision like I made. I think it just started happening, or maybe it's been happening since the beginning that I sort of been speaking to all of you as a group, which I think in my mind I assumed was inclusive and accurate, right? That I am really trying to create a community with this podcast. We very much have a community, I feel like, through Patreon, whether it's on the Discord server or the WhatsApp groups. I see the same people sort of in the book club meetings and in the workshops. And although I know that not all of you are a part of that, many of you are. And I feel like that community has become the people that I end up speaking to when I record. Which has definitely not always been the case. So I'm interested to know if I've changed the way that I've referred to you. But I kind of wanted to apologize to those of you that maybe aren't in this community and maybe you feel alienated by me talking about you guys or this group or all of you, if you're not a part of that. So I wanted to welcome all of you, whether you're in that sort of tight-knit Patreon community or not. Of course, I'm very grateful to have all of you here. I can't necessarily say I'm going to be able to correct my language in the future, but I just wanted to kind of note it because it's fascinating. It's fascinating. I wonder, I listen to other podcasts and I wonder what the differences are as far as how they address the audience. I think when I started the podcast, the advice I got was act as if you're talking to one person, who's sort of a friend, who's sort of symbolic of your audience as a whole. And I do remember doing that in the past. And I actually had a friend, or I have a friend. She's still a friend. But at the time, I felt like she, as a person, was sort of very symbolic of my audience as a whole. And I remember reaching out to her a couple times being like, I feel like sometimes I'm recording podcasts just for you. Because you're for some reason so all encompassing of the person who I feel like would be listening to this. But then I think as the Patreon community grew, which it definitely has, especially in the past year, I feel like I really started thinking about the fact that I'm talking to that group. There's about 60 or 70 or so of you on the Discord server thus far. We would definitely welcome more of you. And yeah, I sort of like that I unintentionally started referring to all of you as you guys, which I do apologize if it's felt weird or alienating. Who is she talking to? What group of people is she talking to? I'm not a part of that group. I don't really want to be a part of that group. So that would maybe be weird. But I have to say the real soul purpose of this podcast in my mind was to create a community. So it's interesting that over time, as that's actually happened, that I just started referring to you guys as you guys. Anyway, I don't need to get too far into that, but I did think it was interesting. I'm interested to hear if you all have noticed that, what your thoughts are. I don't know if it'll change. It's hard not to speak to this core group of amazing humans who I have met virtually and in person and who I feel like I will know for a very long time, possibly for the rest of my life. And I feel like we're only at the very beginning of sort of collaborating and thinking of all the ways to work together and help each other. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's sort of what this podcast eventually births, is really just an in-person community. That was definitely the broad goal when I first launched it a couple years ago, and it's beautiful and a little bit surprising, but mostly I just feel a lot of gratitude for the fact that it's really happened so quickly, and I know will continue to grow. So if you are an individual listener and you have no idea what I'm talking about, I'm very grateful that you're here and that you're listening and that you are participating in this podcast in whatever way that feels fit. And for those of you that are in the community, thank you for supporting me and allowing me to do this. And I think I mentioned this last time that so many of you reach out and say thank you. And it's really like I just, opened the door. You all filled the space. And without people in the room, there wouldn't be much of a community at all. And not to mention, the workshops that we host through Patreon are all either former guests of the podcast or patrons or both. And so it's really a way that we can all share knowledge and all offer what we're good at. Again, it's just me opening the door, but you guys are the substance that's inside. And without that substance, just be me in a room speaking into a mic to nobody. If you would like to become a part of this community more than you are, as I mentioned, we have book clubs that I host quarterly, although last year we did 5. So probably going to be more than quarterly. I really can't read books on my own anymore. It's not very fun. I want to talk to you guys about them all the time. We're doing a new book club in June. We are picking from 3 different books. And if you want to know what those books are, if you want to vote on them, Patreon is the place. As I mentioned, we have workshops. I think someone's going to be hosting, a patron of mine is going to be doing a Reiki workshop next month. We've had people teach foraging and breath work and how to become a more confident creator. We have 2 astrology workshops this month. I have so many playlists that are in the works or that are already released that are for patrons only. And the Discord server, which is amazing. And there's lots of people in there that are talking about all sorts of subjects at all times. So if you're lonely and you're looking to share some sort of virtual online space with like-minded humans, definitely recommend Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/Anya Kotz, you'll see that there are 3 different tiers. There's $5 a month, $10 a month, and $25 a month. $5 a month gets you access to all of the sort of bonus content that I post on Patreon, whether that's like a bonus video that I've recorded in an interview, all of the playlists, and I think a couple of other things, stickers. And then the $10 level is really where all of the value is, in my opinion. So that's where you'll get the workshops, the book clubs, the Discord server, etc. And if you think about it, like basically 2 Starbucks lattes a month, but instead of a couple of cups of non-organic coffee with shitty milk, you get a whole community and you get workshops and book clubs and playlists and tons of stuff that in my opinion is worth far more than $10. Plus with that $10, really what you're doing is helping support me and this project, because there is no other way for me to make money, at least not any other way that I want to. I don't want to have advertisers on the show. I don't want to read ads. I don't want to bog it down with that. So this is like public radio and I need your support. But yeah, I need your support, but also I think if you ask anyone who is involved, that they really enjoy being a part of this community, and that makes me really happy to actually give you guys something that's valuable and have you meet more people who are like you and help you through difficult experiences. Speaking of difficult experiences, this podcast today, Jenny and I touched on this a bit, and I also touched on the idea of a sort of spiritual awakening or spiritual emergency in a solo podcast I posted a little while ago called A Millennial's Guide to Spirituality. And Jenny listened to it, and Jenny said, there's so much more to say. And she was right. And so much of these conversations I end up having with Jenny because she's had so many amazing experiences in this respect and has a lot of really profound insight, has been sort of in many different kinds of spiritual communities throughout her life. And I really value her feedback. And I feel like Jenny was honestly there once I met her in our apprenticeship during my own dark night of the soul. She was such a beacon of just light and someone that I knew I could rely on and who would give me straight up, straightforward information, and who I knew was never going to suck me up into some sort of like transcendent, woo-y cult kind of spirituality. She always kept me really grounded. So I love talking to her about this subject, and I wanted to bring her on to expand upon it further. And also because I think, you know, I love it. I was like not going to talk about this, but this whole conspirituality thing that's going on now, I'm not going to speak that much to this because I don't think it's worth my time to. But a lot of people have reached out to me about that podcast specifically, but about the concept overall, right? That there are these spiritual communities that are sort of like, kind of like the far left is actually quite close to the far right as far as QAnon goes. That there are a lot of people who are kind of anti-government and sort of fall more into the camp of that sort of right-wing group than you might think. And I think this is true. And I think there are a lot of people like that. I've been really sort of disturbed by the amount of spiritual crazy people there are in this day and age. And I feel like COVID has made that become quite clear. And I was actually really excited when I heard there was a podcast called Conspirituality, these sort of spiritual groups that are taking on these conspiracy theories as true, sort of engaging in the same lack of trust of our government and these larger systems as the right-wing folks are. And I was really excited about that because I've definitely seen that as a trend. Although in listening to that podcast, I was just as disturbed, if not more so, by their fundamentalist cult-like rhetoric as I am about the people who they were criticizing. I just don't understand how we can't have nuanced perspectives about anything. I don't understand how we can't think about the fact that, yes, of course, a healthy body living a healthy life with not a lot of stress is going to be far better at dealing with a virus like COVID than someone that's obese and unhealthy and, you know, eats a ton of processed foods and takes a bunch of shitty medications. But still, like, I'm going to get a vaccine to protect other people who are not as healthy. I'm not going to like go on some death rampage and like get everyone sick. Not, you know, for sure, I wish those things were different. I wish those people had access to information and to resources so that we could all be living healthy, happy, hippie lives. But that's just not the case. And, you know, this whole idea of like, oh, well, if you're strong and healthy, don't get the vaccine. That's not the point of a vaccine. It's not just to protect you. It's to protect everyone. And I'll just say, maybe I'll get in trouble for this and lose a ton of listeners, which is fine, because I don't think those are the listeners I want to have. But I've never gotten a vaccine in my life. This was something that was obviously not my choice. My parents decided back in the 80s that they didn't want to vaccinate me. This was like pre-internet. They had to go to libraries and research all of this. And they were never like anti-vaccine as a concept. They just didn't agree with the American schedule of giving vaccines and decided that they would let me and my brother grow up to be adults and to do our own research and to decide what vaccines we wanted and when. My brother has gotten a ton of them before, but I never did. I didn't travel to a place where it felt like I needed to. There wasn't a pandemic that popped up. And so I just never got one. And it was a little bit difficult for me to decide what I wanted to do in this case because I don't trust the mainstream medical establishment. I do think there's a lot of shit going down. I don't think it's a conspiracy per se, but I think when people are making money and our society runs on, you know, this extremely capitalist, patriarchal, runs in such a way that, you know, we don't have necessarily systems that we can trust 100%, but we can trust them a bit, right? Like, man, I could go on such a rant about this, but I am someone that just really doesn't trust that stuff. I don't go to doctors. I don't even remember the last time I took like Advil or Tylenol. I don't participate in the mainstream, you know, medical industrial complex at all. I don't, you know, take antibiotics just because I'm told to. I think these decisions should be contextual. You know, I think even the decisions about the vaccine should be contextual. Do you live in a city or do you live out in the middle of nowhere? Are you working at an old people's home or do you not see anybody all day? You know, like I think we need to be thinking a bit more critically and nuanced about these decisions and whether or not we're going to get them. I personally, a lot of you have reached out to me and asked me to speak about this subject. I'm sort of doing this begrudgingly because it's such a inflammatory topic. But personally, I decided to get a vaccine because I would like to travel this summer. I don't want to put other people at risk who cannot get the vaccine, like people going through chemo. Or have extremely weakened immune systems to the point where they just can't get this. I'm not going to kill them with my irresponsibility or my, what's the word? Privileged ass? That's the word. So I wanted to travel, which is somewhat to protect other people and somewhat selfish. As far as getting the vaccine goes. And also because I wanted to prove to myself that I wouldn't die. I sort of did this same strategy. I was on hormonal birth control when I was a kid. I was a kid. I was 16 when I went on hormonal birth control, and I was on it till I was about 20, 21 maybe. And I went off, and I think going off birth control was extremely detrimental to my body. Nobody told me that I should go off of it responsibly and like support my body in that process. And I think it really was the catalyst for what turned into like 10 years of pretty severe hormonal issues that took me 10 years to figure out. And so obviously after having that experience, I said to myself, like, fuck birth control. I'm never going to do that shit again. I was all about the fertility method and just like being safe, and that's not for me, and I'm all natural and blah, 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 self-righteous bullshit. And then I've decided I didn't want to be pregnant. Like there were too many scares, and I didn't want that looming over my head, and I didn't want to live my life in fear. I did not want to live my life in fear of birth control, because I think there are many amazing things about birth control. And so I decided to get a copper IUD. Granted, not hormonal. I wouldn't do the hormonal thing again, but I think we've sort of looped all birth control into this, like, God forbid we, murder our natural, healthy, clean bodies with the medical industrial complex. And so I don't want to live in that way, right? I don't want to live in fear. And I feel like so many of these sort of conspiracy, anti-government, like it's all this victimhood fear mentality that I just don't subscribe to. And so I decided to get a copper IUD simply to prove to myself that I'd be fine, that I wasn't going to die, that no locusts were going to descend from the sky because I decided to participate in some sort of mainstream medical thing. And in many ways, I did the same for the vaccine. I don't want to be afraid of this vaccine. I don't want to walk around like, oh, I don't know, maybe it's gene therapy, or my period's going to disappear or be really heavy, or just like enough of that. I am smart enough, and I am educated enough, and I am aware enough, and I am intuitive enough to make these decisions for myself in a nuanced, personal way. And I think anytime if we subscribe to the cult of like taking pictures of ourselves, getting the vaccine, and like we believe science, like that is just as bad as the we don't believe science people. Some science is legit. We got to find our way somehow to the middle, or our own version of the middle. So I'm not encouraging anyone to get the vaccine. I want to encourage you to make your own responsible decision for yourself. Stop reading crazy shit online that's not true on either side of the aisle. Make your own decision, and make sure that your decision is not a decision you're making because that's the cool one, or the one that you think other people will support, or the one that cool podcaster you like talked about. Stop doing that. Make your own decisions. And I think the spiritual awakening, the dark night of the soul. Someone asked me the other day, like, can you just tell me about it? Like, what is that? And I do think it's an opportunity for us to like upgrade our consciousness. And Jenny and I speak about this as well on the podcast, but it's like we're given more information than we had before. And it's up to us to find a way to incorporate that information into our lives or not. right? And I think that's something that the dark night of the soul allows us to do or gives us the opportunity to do. But even if you're not in that kind of a crisis, I feel like we're sort of constantly being hit with processes like this at all times, right? You know, we're super triggered by someone and we get really angry with them about what they're doing and what they're saying and why won't they stop, and we're just going crazy. And then we suddenly realize that, like, yes, maybe they're an annoying person, but the fact that I'm this triggered by them has something to do with me. And we sit back and we give ourselves the opportunity to discover what that is. And we realize that, holy shit, what that person is doing that's bothering me so much is the thing that bothers me about myself. But I'm not ready or willing or capable of incorporating that shadow part of myself into my own identity and understanding about who I am. So I'm projecting it onto this other person. Doesn't mean they're not doing that thing, but you found that person just so you could easily project your own shadow onto them. And so in these crazy times that we're in right now, where there is so much information being thrown at us, and I think we're all being triggered in any number of ways, whether we're going through a severe crisis, whether we're going through little crises, whether not much is happening, but just we see everything happening collectively, we're constantly being asked to adjust. We're constantly being asked to be more nuanced, because there is nuanced information everywhere, right? I feel like if we're paying attention, we're going to constantly be hit with contradicting information. And it's up to us to decide what to do with that. And I highly encourage everyone to take little bits of all of it, because that's where the truth is. The truth is not in, the science. The truth is not in the conspiracy about the science. It's somewhere in the middle of all of that. And you're never going to read that truth in an article. You're going to figure that out for yourself. You're going to find what works for you. So that's all I have to say about that. I just think it's crazy to me that we're living in a world right now, especially on the spirituality side, where like I've heard friends of mine are afraid to tell their clients that they got a vaccine because there's so many people in these spiritual realms who are so not just opposed to that action. It's like you as a person cannot be taken seriously. I remember when Chris Ryan was doing a bunch of rants on his podcast about masks, and it was like all these people would reach out, like, I have supported you for years and years and years, but now that I know that you think I should wear a mask, I am dismissing everything, every bit of value that you've ever given me ever. Like, that's your problem. Right? Like, that's crazy. We can all exist and make little different decisions, and it doesn't necessarily mean that that person's entire worldview is different than yours. Or maybe it does. But if that's the kind of worldview then that you want to live in, that black and white, fear-based, victimhood, everything's a conspiracy, or the opposite, right? Like everything that isn't science is a conspiracy. Have fun with that. But that definitely isn't my scene. And I think we'll all do a lot better in the world if we can approach this in a bit more of a nuanced way, like all things. How sick are you guys of hearing me say this? Broken record. I feel like if there was a broken record, it would just be like nuance, 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 paradox, paradox, paradox. You just say those words over and over. That's what's going to happen when my record breaks. Okay, I think I've talked about everything I wanted to. Again, if you would like to participate in this weekend's workshop, patreon.com/Anya Kotz is the place to do that. And when you sign up for $10 a month, you will get access to all sorts of amazing things. If you guys ever have any questions about that or are hesitant to sign up for Patreon because you're confused, please send me a message or an email, anyakotz@gmail.com. You can find me on Instagram @anya.kotz. Send me a DM. You're also very welcome if, like, when you hear me announce different things, like a specific book club or a specific workshop on Patreon, and you just want to sign up to just take that, then do that, right? Just sign up for Patreon for 1 month. It is a monthly subscription. I think also if you want to sign up for a year, you get 10 to 15% off. I think it's 15%. So if you know you want to participate in workshops and book clubs and the Discord server and all of that stuff for the remainder of the year, sign up for a year and you get a discount. But if you just want to participate here and there, you can also always just join and then cancel your subscription. I won't be mad. It's totally fine. I host all of these things through Patreon as opposed to separately, again, because I want to create this community space. I want you all to meet each other. And I felt like if I didn't have a Patreon and it was more like, just pay for this workshop here and pay for this book club over here, that we wouldn't get the same sort of camaraderie and support from one another as I hoped. Plus, it's a more sort of stable way for me to make money each month if I know that there's monthly donations coming in. So patreon.com/Anya Kotz. I'm going to play you in with Blue Sky Mind by Trevor Hall because I feel like I just have to play a Trevor Hall song on every podcast that I release that has something to do with spirituality. Just kidding, but that is how it keeps working out. And so now I'm just like doing it purposefully. This is the first track off of his new album, In and Through the Body. And I feel like when I heard this for the first time, I remember exactly where I was actually. But I was totally sobbing. And I've just been thinking a lot about this whole bringing the spiritual realm down to earth and feeling these things in our bodies. And I think this plays a role in our whole feeling and thoughts and decision making around how we live in the world, whether that's, what sort of place we choose to live in, what sort of vaccinations we choose to get, what sort of ways we wish to speak to other people. All of this stuff really should be coming from a bodily, felt place. And I feel like a lot of these spiritual movements don't do that. They're not talking about the bodily aspect of these things where we're thinking about 5D, 3D, ascension, like all these very transcendent out of body experiences, but we're humans. So to me, the best chance that we possibly have at enlightenment is to tend to the earth in spiritual ways, to tend to our body in spiritual ways, right? There is nothing else we can do. We're not going to be lifted up into the sky on a bed of rainbows. It's not going to happen. And if we keep putting ourselves there on the bed of rainbows floating up to the clouds, I don't think we're going to be able to intuit what is best for us. That's when we're going to subscribe to stupid ideologies that are black and white and that don't speak to our individual experience or needs. And so the more we can embody our spiritual practice, the more we can feel these things within ourselves, the better I think we will all be. So enjoy this song, enjoy this conversation with Jenny. I hope to see you all at the workshop next weekend and at Whitney's workshop the following weekend. And I will catch you on the other side.
How you gonna get free this time? Falling into a blue sky mind. Came to me in that song, my friend. I just wanna go back again. Hey. Mother standing right next to me, showing me what I need to see. Hey. Rain is falling into my mouth. Flowers blooming all up and down. I found in and through the body. It's in and through the body. All along, in and through the body. All along, it's in and through the body. All along, in and through the body. All along, it's in and through the body. All along, in and through the body. All along, it's in and through the body.
Okay, we are recording. I am here with my friend, Jenny, who is
Hi.
returning to the podcast, which is exciting.
It's my honor.
It is my honor as well. Yeah, I really wanted to I feel like even in deciding what we were going to talk about today, I then thought of even like a third topic that I want to bring you on the show to talk about. So there's a lot.
Okay,
but
stay
today...
tuned for that mysterious third topic.
Yeah. I was like, how can I fit that into this topic? Like, no, you can't. You just have to do that another time. But today I wanted to sort of continue the conversation that I feel like I started in a solo podcast I did a little while back called A Millennial's Guide to Spirituality. And I wanted to bring Jenny back on to talk about this stuff because I feel like, first of all, I think I've personally learned a lot from you directly, and you've pointed me in directions of certain, books or teachings, or even just speaking about your direct experience that has been phenomenally helpful for me in like grounding myself into my own spiritual experience. But you've had a very interesting and I think, I don't know, sort of trustworthy and honorable journey with all of this. And so in addition to talking about my own experience going through a spiritual quote unquote awakening, I wanted to bring someone else on to talk about their own personal journey, but also just so we can sort of, I can hear you sort of discuss all of the stuff that you've learned about and gone through. And I think we both have a rather, we just have I think a similar viewpoint and have had similar experiences and have similar opinions about this stuff. So, anyway, thank you for coming back. I guess first it would be, I would sort of like to hear a bit more about when you like sort of adopted spirituality into your life and how that happened and what were the beginning stages of that journey. Obviously, like, we met after you'd already been through a lot and in our astrology apprenticeship, but you have been in this world for quite some time. So interested to hear how that all started for you.
Yeah, it was gradual, but at the same time, from the perspective of the outside world, it seemed very sudden. I was living a very rational, atheistic, I think I would say, adult life. I was an academic. I was working in academia and nonprofits. And I had really staked my identity on being a scholar, being a thinker, and suppressed a lot of my feelings. And we can get into, I had many spiritual experiences when I was a child that there was no way to integrate them into my adult life. So gradually, it started with doing yoga. In 2005, kind of yoga became a thing, and some friends said I should try a yoga class to help me with my flexibility. And from there, I think yoga starts with your physical body and opening up the places in your body that have residues of trauma and, emotional patterning. And so that was a first opening truly to feel my body in a non-disembodied way and to start to connect with that. And then yoga emphasizes mindfulness. So I started mindfulness meditation, and I became really involved in my yoga studio in 2010 and 2011 in DC. I was part of one of the first Vinyasa yoga studios in DC. And that was sort of my community, my life. And so, gradually I deepened an awareness of myself beyond my mind and my identity, and it became more embodied. And then we'd be doing things like, half an hour meditation or chanting Om or inviting a Bhakti Yoga Hare Krishna into class. And those were moments where I would have kind of accidental ecstasy or accidental spiritual bliss, where everybody else is like fidgeting around you, can't get into a mindful state. And I'd be like, on cloud nine, extreme energy in my third eye, like seeing all these colors and lights and having things happen. And even then, it took me a long time to be honest with myself. Like, what was that? I didn't have any framework, which is going to be a big theme of this podcast. Yeah. So I would just kind of brush it off. And as I got deeper into training to become a yoga instructor, we have to read the ancient Hindu Indian texts of yoga. And that made me realize, wait a minute, like I'm learning this purely from mostly a physical point of view, like how to tell someone to get into a handstand. And that's not what this was designed to do. So, I became a yoga instructor, and I went deeper and deeper into Hindu spirituality as a part of integrating that kind of missing side of my yoga practice. And in that, I started to, develop a meditation practice. And the more I got into yoga as a physical discipline, the more I realized I was missing a huge part of my life, which was spirituality. And so I started trying out all these different types of meditation, because I felt like, and a lot of it was ego. Like I felt like I'm good at meditation, like let's see what else I can do with this thing.
Yeah.
Right. So I started meditating with different groups. And I was very influenced in the beginning, around 2011, 2012, kind of the beginning of my spiritual journey, by some friends who were part of the Dharma Ocean Buddhist tradition, part of Shambhala. And they have a practice of meditating with the body. And that helped a lot. But as I kept trying to also, there's a parallel part of this of seeing myself fitting into a spiritual community, which you often talk about in your podcast. So I grew up without a religion in the Unitarian Church because one of my parents was Jewish and one of my parents was Catholic. And, the Unitarian Church seemed to fit our values, our social values, if not any type of religious or spiritual framework. And so, I was meditating with these Buddhists, but then I couldn't see myself being a Buddhist. I would go to these ceremonies where people are taking refuge in the Dharma, and I was like, this isn't me. I'm not ready to take refuge in the Dharma. So I was searching for the thing that was mine for about 3 or 4 years. I lived in Greece, as I spoke about on the previous podcast, and I for years I had tried to fit into Greek Orthodox spirituality. My husband and I almost converted so that we could be married by a Greek priest, which seemed a little extreme, Mm-hmm. And so I was trying things. I was going to Holy Week in the Greek Orthodox Church and deeply communing with Christ and trying to figure out like what is mine and where do I fit in. And it was through yoga that I found my current spiritual practice and if you'd like, I can speak about that now.
Yeah. I want to hear about that. I also want to know if there was ever, it does sound like your journey was gradual, but whether you experienced a sort of crisis in all of this where like suddenly you were hit with a lot of truths or experiences you hadn't had before and couldn't figure out how to work that in, or did that for you happen over a longer gradual period of time?
Yeah. I mean, one of them definitely were these kind of sudden experiences of bliss or what I would call spiritual phenomena, a lot of light, a lot of love. Mm-hmm. And that would happen kind of no matter who I was meditating with. Like one example was I'd be with the Buddhist group and they'd say, concentrate on your heart. And then at the end, everyone's going around and saying, well, I felt nothing. I saw darkness. I felt blackness. I felt sadness. And I was like, I couldn't concentrate on anything because there was so much blinding light at my heart. Like, doesn't everyone else feel this?
Yeah.
And then I'm going, well, what is this? Another crisis definitely was the Christ piece. And that is kind of a theme running through my life. So when I started meditating a lot more, I would, kind of see Christ in my inner vision. And I was really drawn to going to church all the time. And there was like a period where I was reading scripture and talking about it to my husband. And, he really thought I had lost my mind. And then I was hiding the fact from my parents because, I don't know if your experience was the same, but, growing up with Jewish heritage, Christ is not, it was very clear Christ was not welcome in my household.
Yeah. Christ was strangely equated with Hitler in my household.
Right.
It was Jesus who killed the Jews. I don't know if that's, I feel like a little revisionist there.
Yeah. So, I started to really, so those are two big signposts for me. One was the feelings I had in my heart, extreme love, and extreme bliss, as well as, how could I have a vision of Christ if I don't believe in him? Mm-hmm. Right? Or what is, my parents talked about people who were Jesus freaks when I was growing up. And there was a lot of distrust of the evangelical movement in the 80s when I was a kid.
Right.
And so this was somehow you had to be a Christian to know Christ, right? Mm. So how would I know Christ? That was really hard for me to integrate. And now I'm all good. Yeah. But yeah, those types of things.
When you sort of aligned with or decided to move in a specific direction as far as spirituality goes, what did that look like?
Yeah, it was my 36th birthday, and I was getting really frustrated with kind of not knowing where I stood. I wanted my practices. I wanted to find my path. That's what I wanted. So I went and meditated on my 36th birthday, and I prayed. And this whole time, I was not into praying. Again, praying is loaded, right? For praying was not a thing that I learned how to do in my family or not at the Unitarian Church. We did not pray. And so I said this prayer it was a one-line prayer. Please, God, help me to find my path. And part of it in the back of my mind was well, what job should I take, or, what's happening to me in my life? It was a very practical, ego-centered, help me get through this. Yeah. And another part of me was what's my path and my purpose? So I said that prayer. And then I was listening to a yoga podcast with a wonderful yogi in San Francisco, Darren Main. And he interviewed this very old yogi. This man died a couple of weeks later, I believe, called Swami Kriyananda. And he was talking about his entire life and this Hindu yogic path and his guru. And I heard his voice and I was like, this is it. This is a thing I want. And I got the book. It was Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda. And when I looked at the cover of the book, and this is not an uncommon experience with my guru, Paramahansa Yogananda, it was the photograph of my guru was connecting to me. I could feel energy emitting from it. I could feel the picture's eyes looking in my eyes. And I was instantly in bliss. Mm-hmm. When I ordered the book from Amazon, Yeah. And so that was I read the book in a couple of days, and I wrote to the organization and said, I'm ready to become a disciple. And I haven't, although I can talk about how my path has changed and, how once you get on the spiritual path, it's not what you expect. And there are a lot of twists and challenges. And I think I'm part of this organization called Ananda Church of Self-Realization Fellowship, and they're one of the longest running spiritual communities in America, and they have communities all over the world. But they're a group and a container, and that's what I was looking for. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, it's been challenging for me to realize that I can't do everything the way they might like to conform, mm-hmm. or to be on the spiritual path in the same way. I'm not a vegetarian. I don't meditate an hour and a half every day. Things like that.
So what was it about these teachings in particular do you feel like it was like something you can even explain logically as to why you felt sort of taken by these teachings or this container relative to some others that you'd experienced?
Yes. So these teachings in this container makes space for Christ, as well as a lineage of Indian gurus. And we believe that Christ was a yogi and that Christ was teaching the same thing as this yogic spiritual path in terms of meditation, love, enlightenment, and many yogic paths describe your energy body and what happens in meditation, or your subtle body or your astral body. But my guru brought a set of techniques and meditations for working with that energy body. That was very helpful. The other is, this is a devotional spiritual practice, and that means it's kind of a path of the heart. And being in a relationship with God or the guru, the divine, that is in a I-you relationship, like it's an actual relationship. And the path emphasizes loving God and offering yourself to God, as opposed to, now some of my Buddhist friends might disagree with this, but speaking from my personal experience, when I was trying on Buddhism, there wasn't a real devotional I-you, like God emphasis in the path, in that practice and path. And that's what I needed. I wanted to be in a relationship with God. Yeah.
So I think the way that you did this, the journey that you went on, specifically around identifying with a guru or having like this person, right? I think used to be very common, I think especially in the 60s, for example, but I think is far less common nowadays. And I'm interested to hear, I guess, two things. One, why you chose that direction to go versus sort of like, I'm just going to make up my own way and be my own God and do all of that. But then also, I'm interested to hear what you think about why we've strayed from identifying with or following a guru versus what feels to me now like a much more sort of broadened, I don't need to worship a person who represents God because I am that. Like it's a more like, figure it out as you go kind of a thing. And I'm interested to hear why you think it's sort of fallen out of style for us to have that more specified like container or whatever.
So I should clarify that my guru, Paramahansa Yogananda, whom I took initiation to, he died in 1952. So our lineage is, handed down. There's two spiritual organizations that represent him, and both offer these initiations. And so our lineage is handed down through tradition and through people who, let's say, carry that energy and can initiate you. Right. So not having a guru in the body, again, seems easier. It may sound harder, but to me, the relationship has to be internal and inner, and something that is really discerned through myself, through my heart in meditation, and not based on an external authority figure. So that's one reason why I think my spiritual path may fit a little bit more with this time, because I think your question is getting to the fact that there have been a lot of gurus that came to the West in the 20th century, and spiritual teachers who, for one reason or another, have broken trust, been fraudulent, perpetrated abuse, and changed the view that we have in our culture of a guru, and made it to be something of a bad thing. Whereas traditionally, the teachings my teachings are based on Hinduism, but I'm not part of a strictly Hindu spiritual path. But the teaching is that the guru is the wayfinder, the teacher who shows you and helps you along the spiritual path, because it's very dangerous. So ask me your question again. What else? What other parts would you like me to include?
Well, just sort of like, yeah, I mean, I guess you did answer that. I think you answered both of them. Why you decided on that path, but also why we've strayed from it, I feel like, in many ways. And I wonder too, whether we've misunderstood what a guru is supposed to be. And so, I mean, and let's broaden our lens a little bit and look at this as any kind of spiritual teacher that we engage in, where I feel like sometimes part of the problem is that we're looking for that person to be this like perfect godly, like perfect God in human form kind of a thing. And when the person makes a human error or has humanness of any kind, we say, oh, okay, well, therefore that person doesn't deserve me following them, and also isn't what they say they are.
Yes,
I think that's a weird thing that like Westerners do, is we don't understand what a guru is to begin with, so we don't recognize that they're supposed to be like a symbolic form of something. I don't know what your thoughts are about that. But.
Yeah, I mean, I think in my tradition, we would distinguish between a guru who is an avatar, and many gurus come and say they're avatars, but an avatar is someone who is someone who's incarnated, who is like Christ, no longer has any karma, has transcended this reality, and doesn't need to incarnate in order to work through their karmic challenges or to achieve enlightenment. So right off the bat, my guru, he's taught that he's an avatar. So he's not human in a way. He has taken a human birth, but he's not still working out all of the challenges we humans have. And so I think the way that you're using the term guru or spiritual teacher is to acknowledge that we're human, and we're not free of karma or attachments. We're not here specifically on divine mission to help uplift humanity, but we can all be a part of it. Yeah. And we don't the word guru has come to mean, some sort of divine enlightened teacher who is above everyone else. And that's where we have problems, because we don't understand these terms. In our culture, we don't have a framework for spiritual awakening at all.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. I know you work with a lot of clients who've been through various forms of this. Obviously, you have, I have, and I'd love to sort of talk about what is a spiritual awakening, what does that look like, what are some examples, because obviously they can occur in multiple different ways. Mm-hmm. What is it that we're referring to when we say a spiritual awakening or a spiritual crisis of some kind?
I think it's an opening to something larger than yourself. And in our Western world, we call that an existential crisis, like what is our existence? But to me, the reason spiritual awakening or spiritual crisis or spiritual emergency is such a big problem is that our world thinks of itself as separate from God. Since, the Enlightenment or the dawn of Western scientific materialism, there's been a separation between the church, which is seen as like the authority on religion and spirituality, and science or the secular world. Mm-hmm. And I think we see so many spiritual crises because people are finding that this separation is not valid or doesn't reflect their own inner experience. And so a spiritual awakening can be, anything, realizing your oneness with an animal that you happen to see on the side of the road and roadkill,
Yeah.
And feeling compassion for that deceased animal. Or it can manifest in, taking psychedelics and having a unitive experience. Or, I think in meditation, like my experience, I've never taken psychedelics, and I've had many experiences of non-ordinary states of consciousness brought on by, let me set my mindfulness timer for 15 minutes, right?
Yeah.
So I think what a spiritual crisis or a spiritual awakening looks like, there is an opening beyond your sense of yourself as an individual, that is bound and not connected to others. My own consciousness, my own ego. And then on the other side, that brings a crisis because we don't know what that means.
Right. Yeah, it was interesting reading this book that you told me about, Spiritual Emergency. I forget which essay it was in particular, but it was described in such simple terms, like, there is an opening for a growth in consciousness, right? Like a growth in awareness. And it's that simple. It's just like, it's time to grow a little bit. It's time to like,
Right.
It's like I could, akin to traveling, let's say, to another country for the first time and recognizing that there are like far more experiences of what it's like to be human than just your own, right? Like that too is a sort of growth in consciousness or an opening for that. And I think this one, to sort of look at it that simply, right? And whether it's like through a near-death experience or a psychedelic experience or a fucking UFO experience or just a crisis in your life, a health crisis, an emotional crisis, whatever, that's what's going on. It's like, oh, there's more here than you realized. And I don't know, I feel relatively grateful for the way in which I experienced this. I mean, I was quite alone and didn't really have a spiritual container or guidance in this realm. I mean, I did learn about it a lot, but it did feel extremely manic and crazy. But it really, like, if I think back on it, that's what was going on. It was just like, oh, okay, expand your consciousness now to include these other types of ways of existing, these other ways of seeing the world, these non-ordinary states of consciousness. Do you think, on the one hand, I guess we can talk about, like, again, the lack of the container and the framework. Yeah, let's maybe start there. How does the fact that we don't have containers for this, or we don't have gurus, appropriate ones, that is, or guidance, like how is that affecting people to the point where they're not integrating these experiences? I don't want to say properly, but I sort of do, in a way that allows them to live a fuller, more honest life as opposed to descending into some sort of strange psychosis.
Yeah. I mean, I think it comes down to, we don't talk about what are the risks of a spiritual opening and how to support one on that journey, which is what traditionally a guru would do. But yeah, we don't have a container to understand, or a framework, actually. A framework for what happens in our bodies, what happens in our emotions, what happens in our psyche, and what is beyond, kind of this world. Or we don't have a spiritual framework for that at all as well, besides what physics has offered us. So I think one of the big pitfalls is consumerism and consumption of quick fix, or all of these different techniques. Like going and the consumerism and consumption, because we think like a spiritual awakening is a problem to be solved, right?
Yeah.
So there's everything. There's going to an ayahuasca temple in Peru and doing ayahuasca, which is helpful for many people. But, a lot of people are going there to try to solve this problem that they feel inside of themselves, or to quote unquote awaken.
Right. There's an agenda for sure.
Yeah, an agenda. And then, so that's one problem, and that involves appropriation of other cultures and abuse of all kinds of indigenous practices and traditions, because, basically we're the only culture, this sort of Western European culture, that has not really condoned a supernatural or expanded version of consciousness.
Yeah.
So that's a huge problem. Yeah. And I also think then there, on the other side, there's another issue with discernment. So discerning what is happening to you, discerning whether someone who's offering you something you need in your spiritual awakening or enlightenment is where that person is coming from. What is it going to give you? What's happening to you? So there's a lot of manipulation, narcissism, and just there's too much of an opening and no container.
Right. And let's just work that backward a little bit. It's my feeling that the vast majority of the people who fulfill those roles, that sort of narcissistic, egoic, quote unquote healer person, that identity is a result of that person's spiritual awakening emergency not integrating properly.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that we can, I may still be guilty of this. I think that you can see that play out from your yoga instructor to the person you go on a psychedelic retreat to your astrology teacher, to everything in between, right? Because it takes a lot of work to process and integrate these experiences.
Right. So let's talk about what's happening there. And I feel like I'd be interested to hear how you've personally experienced this and worked your way out of it. I feel like, I talked about this on the last episode I recorded in regard to this, but I certainly felt like, again, because I had no examples, no container, no guidance, and no framework to understand this stuff, that truly when I started, and for me, I think it started with a feeling of, I'm miserable, but I know I'm supposed to be here. That in and of itself felt spiritual to some extent. Then it was like the onslaught of really intense synchronicity. And then it was like deep waves of grief that put me into what I can pretty accurately describe as a psychedelic state where I was experiencing, many lifetimes of people and animals and the planet, and just everything sort of made sense, this undeniable connectivity. And the immediate reaction I had to a lot of that, especially because it was coinciding with a point in my life that I was setting a lot of boundaries with people and cutting people out of my life and being I need to move on. It very initially manifested as, oh my God, I've been given access to these types of experiences and certain realms that other people have not been given, and therefore that means I'm special and better than them. And I think I can't exactly, I can't point to the steps to which, I have certain experiences where I kind of caught myself in my own ridiculousness and insanity. So it's funny to me that like other people go through that process and don't get the same hit of check yourself that I did. But I'm interested to hear what you have to say and what you experienced in that regard. Like this feeling of immediately like I'm God. And that feels like really real for a moment there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what you're talking about is both emotional and phenomenological, or it's a phenomenon, spiritual phenomena.
Right.
That, when you don't have a framework, you don't have anyone to help you contain it, you can get into depression, mania, and, some forms of psychosis. And so I wouldn't say I've experienced psychosis, but, there were a lot of times where I just felt so alone. I felt like, why do I have to, why do I have to like endure seeing my past lives or having a vision of Christ on a Tuesday afternoon? Like, it's lonely and scary. And also maybe I am special because no one else is talking about this. So just really, it takes a lot of understanding where your spiritual awakening is meeting your own trauma, and where historic PTSD or states of ungrounded nervous system or triggers or, whatever your own nervous system trauma is, how that's meeting, or being stirred up by your spiritual awakening. And I'm still on that journey. I have a lot of childhood trauma from a premature birth, and I suffered from epilepsy and other neurological conditions when I was a child. And that's definitely trauma in my nervous system. Also, were some of those experiences early spiritual awakenings? Yes. I mean, I was in not ordinary states of consciousness at 3, 4, 5, seeing my past lives. So finding a container for me, it ended up being a Jungian, my Jungian therapist for many years. She was the only person I talked to about this. And one of the challenges I definitely had was that my spiritual group is somewhat open to talking about these things, but I found that even in the other meditation groups and circles I tried out, there's a real kind of orthodoxy of not talking about this stuff. Like, I've had numerous Kundalini experiences, awakenings, or, experiences of intense energy that makes my body shake and weave and spiral, and involuntary movements and extreme headaches for many years. And it's like, well, there's one person in my group you can talk to about that, and that's why I love this book, Spiritual Emergency, that you referred to, by Stan and Christina Groff, because they name Kundalini awakening as a spiritual emergency. So I think we need more spaces to just talk about this and discern. Like, am I having a Kundalini awakening, or do I just have a lot of anxious energy in my body? And should I, seriously, like, should I try something like trauma releasing exercises? Both have been true for me.
Right. Yeah. There's such a romanticizing and glamorizing of these things that I find really problematic. And I think I've even seen like memes going around, like what people think a spiritual awakening is like versus what it actually feels like, like bliss and just amazing rainbows versus like, oh my God, a lot of inner shadow work and like trauma and grief.
Right.
And so I think we're sort of tapped into that to some degree, but it's still really blows my mind the extent to which we glamorize a Kundalini awakening or a psychedelic experience, and it becomes this sort of like this weird badge of honor, or like, let me post about my experience on Instagram and just showcase like what a fucking guru I am or whatever. And I think that's part of the problem too, is that these, at least in my experience, all of these sorts of experiences have been really not anything I'd want to post on the internet. I mean, it's like me in a fetal position on my floor with like snot coming out of my nose and like naked with crystals balancing on my body. You know, like that's what's happening.
Yeah. My husband used to be like, could you stop your Kundalini awakening because you're going to give your neck whiplash, you know, because my head is like flying everywhere. Right.
Right. Yeah. So I want to sort of go back to something we were sort of chatting about before we started recording, which is this idea of, I think, let's say, regardless of what it is you're experiencing, you know, and it's described this really well in the book too. It's like we experience these sort of states of, yes, there's all the crap, but there's also truly like beauty and bliss and love that a lot of us haven't ever experienced before, and we're sort of reminded of it in a way. But this confusion between, you know, this thing that makes us feel like we're special or we're God versus these realms are all around me and I'm a part of it, but I'm not necessarily special. And there's a lot of people who have gone through this before. Like, what is this thing that's happening where people take it too personally? And do you think that's what's happening? At least as far as a lot of these sort of fake self-made shaman go, it's like that's what they're taking on. Like, oh, I'm really special and I got access to all these realms, therefore I'm a god.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I think I've experienced this more since I went out on my own and became an astrologer, and I'm consuming so much content of other people like me who are selling coaching. I mean, that's what I'm offering. I'm offering coaching at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
It's just like, you know, someone who's going to coach you on your mindset or your marketing or your business. Although I would, in the sense that that's a paradigm, right?
Yeah.
That we're selling our spiritual knowledge or guidance through.
Yeah.
So we have this tendency that everything that's going to happens to us, we commodify, you know,
Right.
To build some sort of, you know, visibility or authority through our experiences. And, you know, it's a lot like what you've talked about, like in your first Dark Night of the Soul.
Yeah.
You know, in terms of like synchronicity, you know, the story about seeing the license plates and, you know, now I understand everything and I've got the codes or I've figured it out, right?
Codes, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
We immediately want to sell that and build our own authority and profile through that instead of reflecting on, I had an amazing experience of synchronicity, but what does that mean like for me in terms of my relationship with other people? Right.
So let's talk about the commodification, because I would like to hear how you've maneuvered through that. It is definitely something for me that I sort of did right off the bat just because that's the culture I grew up in. And like, why take an astrology apprenticeship if you don't turn around and charge people for readings? It just was like, and I didn't even really want to become an astrologer, but even still, I took it on as the thing to do. And, you know, we're all trying to make ourselves, you know, create some sort of self-made business brand identity.
Exactly.
And, you know, I do think maybe, you know, is that one way in which our culture is not super amenable to these types of experiences or practices because they were never meant to be commodified like this. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, what you're referring to is being a shaman was a sacred calling. And if you study, and I'm no expert in shamanism, but like a cursory glance of any traditional accounts of what it means to be a shaman is extreme adversity. Sometimes not a blessing, but a curse.
totally.
And, you know, this whole time I was going through the spiritual awakening, my therapist kept telling me that if I lived in a traditional society, I'd be out in the woods by myself having profound spiritual experiences. And then I'd come back when I'd integrate them into community and offer that as a service into healing. So yes, part of the problem is we have absolutely zero sacred framework for this. It seems like it's just one more thing, you know, and there's so much. One of the things that bothers me right now is 4D, 5D, awakening. You know, sorry to anyone that I offended with my tone of voice.
Go on.
You know, and there's all these people who are teaching these techniques and support for ascension. And, you know, in my spiritual teachings of my guru, like ascension is, yes, it can happen overnight when you least expect it, but also it's the work of, you know, thousands of lifetimes of effort and, you know, comes from completely letting go of your ego and merging into divine consciousness, which, you know, someone selling supplements that's going to help you with your ascension, that's not the same thing.
Well, and also is that goal in and of itself, you know, I definitely went through a period of time and it was made worse by learning astrology and learning that I have my North Node, which is sort of like, let's just say my soul's journey in Pisces in the 12th, which is literally like, if you're going to put ascension anywhere in the chart, it's that space. And so here I am going through this spiritual emergency and learning astrology and like, oh my God, that's my destiny to be like an ascended, enlightened rainbow being. And I really took that on. And then I don't even think it was intentional. I just think over time as the sort of film was ripped off so many times for me and experiencing so many like kind of gross, fucked up things in this world that, you know, I guess I sort of realized that having that as a goal, I mean, and how many of these sort of also older stories about, you know, these gurus teaching people who come to them and say, how do I achieve enlightenment? And it's like, already you fucked it up. Like already you're coming at it the wrong way, right? Where I think that's a big piece too. We have an agenda. And I'm not so sure if that's the most appropriate way to traverse this stuff.
Well, I might push back a little bit on that because, you know, my guru's teachings is that you won't get onto the spiritual path until you have a desire for it and a desire to know God. And that's part of what the awakening is. And that was my experience, is like, I really wanted to know God.
Yeah. Right. But I think that's slightly different than, I mean, certainly, like, we need to have intentionality about things. But if you have this idea of what enlightenment or ascension is, and so then you just, like, do a bunch of these activities to get there, like, I don't actually think you know what there is yet. Let alone, like, again, like you said, taking supplements or, you know, these people that I see this now cropping up a lot, like, oh, I'm going to do like a week-long darkness retreat or something. Like, I think there are also a lot of ways that we go too hard, too fast into certain practices that are not, you know, anyway, I'll stop talking and let you say something.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, okay, I'm going to go into that point in just a moment, and I'll just wrap up on ascension, 4D living, whatever is, you know, like there's a lot of talk right now with the current astrology about how, this is an amazing opportunity for humanity to awaken and ascend. And there are spiritual teachers that I respect who are bringing this message forward. But I think that's in response to the fact that we're in a global crisis. Like, our world, our planet is failing. The ways that we live as humans are unsustainable. Mm-hmm. So yes, it is time for a global awakening. And now I want to go back to what your question was.
What was my question? Having thinking what enlightenment is, and then crossing a bunch of things off your list in order to attain it. And what is this? I mean, I think you were actually really instrumental in me being a bit more humble about my nodal journey and just spiritual journey overall, which was maybe this lifetime, Anya, isn't meant for you to truly transition into some sort of ascended master, but that's just the direction. Just go the direction. There's no goal or end game. But I do think that, and again, so Western, right? This idea that there's a finish line, that once we get here, we will be ascended, we will be enlightened, we will be awakened, and then we shut off any other growth that may need to come in.
Yes, your question was about going super fast.
Oh, right.
Towards
that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's that issue of going full on towards your own spiritual awakening or your ascension, whatever, is one of the huge things I'm afraid of right now with all of the psychedelic psychotherapy and what's going on in the psychedelic industry and, pharmaceutical companies or psychedelic venture capital, or just the widespread availability of psychedelic psychotherapy.
Yes.
Because those medicines are really powerful. And it's not that people haven't been, since the 1960s or earlier, people have been taking these medicines without a container. This has been going on for a long time. But we're at this point again now, and more people are ready for a spiritual awakening, so-called.
Right.
And so I think there's a huge risk for almost I don't know. Do you have this feeling like a mass psychosis?
I wonder sometimes if we're not already in that.
Yeah.
Just perusing the spiritual realm of Instagram on any given day between the I'm channeling the codes and I have this crystal shop and here's me and my partner with our perfect bodies in bikinis right after doing ayahuasca and going on this whole rant underneath about the power of psychedelics. You just posted a picture of you in a fucking bikini. What is going on here? This is off in so many ways. And yeah, I agree. I also worry because of the time period we're in. It's this is a perfect opportunity to go in a different direction, but what direction are we going in? One that is farther delusional and farther bypassed, or one that's actually inviting us to do the actual hard soul work to just know more of ourselves, and have a conversation with our shadow and not use these practices to avoid it. And I think one really potent way I see that we're delusional is all of the people, a lot of people in the psychedelic world who are oh, if only Trump could just take ayahuasca. It's just do you not understand that to me, this enlightenment stuff, this ascension stuff, whatever you want to call it, it's a collaborative effort between you, your intention, your willingness to be beaten down to some extent, have the layers peeled off, and whatever tool you decide to use, whether that's astrology or psychedelics or any of the above, meditation, all this stuff. And that isn't what, I don't think that's understood very much in our culture. It's like, I'm just going to take this, and we call it medicine, which is also
Exactly.
like medicine, and even the word shaman is exported from the West. And we don't know any of this stuff. We don't realize how our own framework has infiltrated the meaning and experience of these things. But we think we can just, it is like a supplement or like
Yes.
any sort of mainstream pharmaceutical. We think that we can just take that and it'll fix us, which is so misguided and ultimately dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think you alluded to the fact that one of the things we really need is community. Like, the awakening isn't just personal, it's community and a communal understanding of what happens to someone when they start the process.
Right. And the right kind of community. I mean, that's the other problem, I think, too, is that there are now communities based around the misuse of these tools.
Yeah.
Which it's like it's capitalizing on people's. I mean, I think identitarian movements are the same. There's all these things in life that are capitalizing on our utter existential loneliness and isolation and confusion. Yes. And they're all cults in my mind. I mean, it's cult-like. It's like, here's what to believe, here's who to follow, here's what to do. Which is maybe a good segue to talk about that discernment piece a little bit more. Both personal discernment, but also communal discernment.
Yeah. I think discernment can't really take place until we have a relationship with what's going on in our physical bodies, and our emotional selves, and understanding our personal trauma, or attachment wounds, whatever you want to say. Because then we just keep projecting or acting from that triggered place. So discernment for me, and this is part of my training, I work in the compassionate inquiry psychotherapeutic method of Dr. Gabor Mate. But the body is primary. And it took me so long to be okay with that. I mean, I was an intellectual. I thought I could just think my way out of my problems. And I have a strong mind. And my therapist had to train me how to be in my body and not disassociated. So discerning what you really feel is important. And that gets back to a theme you often talk about in terms of returning to your own intuition. Intuition happens in your body. Intuition doesn't just happen and like, oh, I know what the right thing to do is. You know, it's discerning how you actually feel. And then from there, applying that embodied discernment and knowing what's true for you. So that's what I mean, that first discerning what's happening for you helps you to develop the practice of knowing what's really going on, even if it's uncomfortable. You know, knowing that in this situation I was really triggered and I've got to learn how to handle that.
Right.
And I didn't. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say the other person is actually not safe, like that's, I think, a very key.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And discerning. So that involves, we are in a moment where fear is extreme in our world. And so when you discern what is going on for you in your body in terms of fear in general, in any given moment, then you're able to say, okay, I don't feel safe now because of something that's happening, or I don't feel safe in general because of trauma.
Right. And that person just provoked it. They just reminded me of it. Yeah.
But also, we need our rational minds. Like, for a long time in my spiritual journey, I assumed that I had been too rational and that I just needed to kind of give it all up and be in this, let me just see how the universe is unfolding for me type of space. But I quickly ran into resistance, like I said, because I had, my own problems in my spiritual awakening, that continuing to follow the path, like keep going with meditation practices that were exacerbating my Kundalini problems, and not think, maybe I should stop doing this. Like that was a huge one. Like actually, rationally, objectively, the data is showing me that this is not okay for me. And the answer is not just to keep blindly going into some unknown territory. So it's very tricky, but you learn to trust yourself in those situations and understand when you can put your trust or safety in the hands of someone else and when you can't.
Yeah, I had this woman, Clementine Morgan, on the show, and she does a lot of writing around like trauma-informed polyamory, and I think she does a really good job of describing, and let's be honest, like so many of us have been traumatized or have some trauma to work through, and I think, there is a lot of rhetoric now around like trusting your body and intuition and your body, and like until you though can discern the difference between being triggered and having like some sort of like honestly complex PTSD attack versus my intuition telling me I'm not safe here, you really do need to actually employ your logic and rationality alongside your emotions. And I think that's, I don't know, I think there's also sort of a thread that, or two different threads that are meeting each other in a lot of this too in our world, where like, we are getting triggered and we're acting from a place of emotion, even in the spiritual awakening, right? Like, oh my God, I feel taken aback by all of this beauty and all of this stuff and this love and this, but you need your rational mind to come in and be like, okay, but you're not, don't take that on as your ego. Like the point is to, right? And if we were only focused in that realm of sort of bodily or emotional experience, we can, go way too far into that. Like, then of course that's such a problem in our world. Like we don't know how to hold two truths at once. We don't know how to like say that you need your mind and your body. Like to me, this is as a Libra moon, very obvious, like two things coexist, and that's the whole point. But yeah, we have a very hard time sorting that.
Yeah. And I think that's that process of find a way to figure out how to sort that out for yourself. No matter what you do, there's a lot of different ways. And more of that information is available. And I think for those of you listening who may be feeling like, oh, well, I don't have big T trauma, I wasn't abused, or I've never experienced significant neglect or injury. Our world creates trauma, the way that we are raised, the systemic racism and the culture of white supremacy that we are born into in this culture creates extreme disassociation and attachment wounds. So all of us need to do that work, to really return home to ourselves and to our own authentic sense of what's true for us.
Yeah. Can we talk too about what you were mentioning, because I think it's important, about the sort of intersection or misunderstanding of discernment versus skepticism?
Yeah. And this is my, I guess you could say, axe to grind. And because I am now working in a very spiritual space and open about my own clairvoyant abilities and practices. So maybe I think personally I get upset with the whole skepticism movement because skepticism kind of takes this point of view of like, I won't believe it until it's proven to me in hard matter, or in some sort of provable, data-driven, empirical, materialistic way. And that's where so many of us are coming from. I need to have compassion for that, because that's what we think is like the world to us is founded on the principle of scientific materialism, and that it's not provable unless it's in matter. So skepticism kind of takes that point of view, looking at spiritual or psychic phenomena, versus discernment is much more of, where is this experience coming from in me? Like even just saying like, I need to, like, for example, I alluded to having visions of Christ. How would I prove that?
Right.
Like, would I prove, prove like, okay, Christ, come to me for a 10th time now, and then I'll believe it's you? Or what is that even? How can you even prove that? Or is someone going to sit down and interview me and say, like, here are the 10 times, and empirically I can say that Jenny, has communed with Christ, right? And so versus discernment is more of, what does this experience mean for me? What did it feel like? Was it shocking? Was it enlightening? Was it scary? Why? And why do I need to, I could even analyze myself, like, why do I need to talk about it with you now? Right. Like, what's coming? Where are all the different places in me that this is coming from?
Right.
And do I need it to be true objectively, or is it true for me subjectively, and is that enough?
Right. And then taking it a step further, which is like, okay, I'm accepting that I'm having these visions or these experiences, and the discernment comes around, like, how do I integrate that, right? Mm-hmm. Does it mean I'm special? Does it mean I'm God? Does it mean I'm crazy? Does it mean I need to teach this, right? Like, that's the piece that's more important. And then, and also then what's happening, like, taking this a little bit further, once we accept, let's say, that there are truths beyond the scientific materialistic world, and there is magic and miracles and all of these things that we can't prove, right? I mean, this is why the whole prove astrology is real concept overall is just silly. Because to me, I always say, like, you're literally asking me to prove God is real. How would that work? Like, isn't the point that we can't prove it? And I remember very early on, I read some quote that totally probably catapulted me into all of this, but it said that coincidence is God's way of staying anonymous. and it was like so perfect, because it was like, oh, I'm not meant to group the world into these scientific versus spiritual realms. That's not the point. The point is that they can coalesce. But this other sort of danger in the mass psychosis, I guess, of when people take these on and have these experiences and then